Donald Trump will spend the next 2 days campaigning in Iowa as he promises a big win in the state that kicks off the Republican nominating contests. He's holding 4 rallies there today and tomorrow after phoning it in last night, literally. His son Eric put him on speakerphone as an Iowa event went on to deliver a message to his supporters.
We love you. I'm going to be coming out there on Friday. I'm going to be there Friday and Saturday. Then I'm coming back the following week. And I'm going to caucus probably in Des Moines. I'll be doing caucus with you. We're going to work it, and we can't take any chances. And everybody has to get out because we don't want to sit back and rely on the polls. Yeah.
The panel is back with me. I mean, that last part really says it all. You got to get out. You got to go and caucus.
Absolutely, and I think Donald Trump is right in the way he's playing this, and that's the problem with Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis. Yes, they're making really interesting new closing arguments, trying to do the best thing they can to get in the game with Trump, but Trump's got a closing argument of his own, and he's coming from the position as the front runner. So he already has an enthusiastic base. He already has folks who, of course, in Iowa, especially the evangelical voters, they're ready to support him. And now he's coming in with his own closing argument to say, hey, stick with me through caucuses. The fact that he's saying, I'm going to be there caucusing with you, he's like, come on, let's get this thing done.
Yeah, no question. Okay, so that is in Iowa, which obviously is the first ball game that we're going to see in 10 days. He has an ad running there, his team does, and it's actually already kind of looking ahead to the general hitting Joe Biden on the economy. In New Hampshire, interesting that there is an ad, his campaign is running an ad that goes against not just Joe Biden, but Nikki Haley. So that's one ad, and just to give a little bit of context, the Trump campaign and his super PAC have spent $4.5 million in New Hampshire just going after Nikki Haley. That says a lot about the concern they have about Nikki Haley's rise.
Period, full stop. There's really no other way to read that. And not only if he blunts her in New Hampshire, he's blocked that momentum, and it's hard to see where she picks it back up. If he fails to, he may create an opening for himself that creates a problem where there wasn't one. So if you're going to spend the money in a primary, that's where you would spend it, and that's how you would spend it on. It doesn't seem surprising to me at all. Interesting to see how she will play it. She's had a couple of totally unforced errors, of her own doing, and I think that'll be a really important test for her.
Well, it is that kind of the line that she's trying to walk that we were talking about earlier, which is trying to appeal to people, even, and it's certainly true in New Hampshire, not Democrats but independents, and trying to get in Iowa people who are not traditional Republican caucus voters to go out and get her. But she also is very much trying to say to the Trump wing of the party, I'm still one of you. And this new ad that she's got running in New Hampshire with General Don Bolduc, who was the Republican Senate candidate, very much in the mold of Donald Trump, even though he didn't fully get endorsed by Donald Trump. Listen to what he says in this new ad.
I'm General Don Bolduc. Look, I'm MAGA all the way. I've always been America first. But this time, I'm for Nikki Haley for president. With Trump, there's too many distractions. It's too much risk of losing. Nikki's a strong conservative. She'll take Joe Biden to the clink.
Take Joe Biden to the clink. This is kind of on the backstory here. What's going on along with this kind of new ad is Don Jr., Steve Bannon, others in Donald Trump's actual orbit are very, very vocally warning against Nikki Haley in any respect, not just for president, obviously, but in the notion of her being on the ticket with Donald Trump.
Right. And I was just watching that ad, and I was contrasting it in my head. If you're talking about the different sort of voters that she's trying to appeal to. So she has that endorsement who is a Trumpy guy in Don Bolduc. And then you have another key New Hampshire Republican endorser, John Sununu, who is certainly not a Trump guy. Or sorry, Chris Sununu. Hi, yikes.
It's okay. There's a lot of them up there.
So you do, just in those two endorsements alone from New Hampshire Republicans, you do see that line that she's trying to straddle and the broad appeal that she's trying to give to New Hampshire Republican voters.
And I think, again, that's a great strategy. I don't know if that's a Republican primary strategy that will work. Because, again, in New Hampshire is a different type of primary, so maybe that's good for New Hampshire. But generally speaking, Republican voters have told us time and time again that their party is leaning further to the right. They haven't, in a lot of states, been open to the more centrist candidates. That electability in a general election doesn't always translate in a Republican primary. But again, New Hampshire is a different kind of state with a different kind of primary. So maybe that will help her build a coalition.
But it's also very Trumpy when it comes to the Republican base. We would be remiss in talking about Donald Trump if we didn't talk about Donald Trump, the client, Donald Trump, the person who has been indicted more than 90 times on various counts. And I say that, of course, because as we get closer to the caucuses, to the primaries, he's going to peel off the trail, probably a fair amount, to be in courtrooms, including next week he'll be here in D.C. at the appellate court at a hearing there. I want to play something that one of his lawyers, Alina Habba, said on Fox yesterday, and it's about what they hope that the Supreme Court does on the idea of whether or not he should be subject to the kinds of laws that other people who weren't president are.
I think it should be a slam dunk in the Supreme Court. I have faith in them. You know, people like Kavanaugh, who the president fought for, who the president went through hell to get into place. He'll step up. Those people will step up, not because they're pro-Trump, but because they're pro-law.
If I'm Brett Kavanaugh, I'm like, okay, well, you just put me in a box. And not that it matters. They are lifetime appointments. But so it's the notion of immunity. And then, of course, the question of whether or not he can be kicked off the ballot in Colorado and Maine and anywhere else.
Well, first of all, I think it's a pretty dangerous game to be predicting what nominees who were appointed by someone are going to do. That just seems like it's courting trouble. But having said that, I think these are two fundamentally different questions. Number one, does the sort of Maine approach or Colorado approach, does that make it through the court? But the other is the question, the broader question of presidential immunity. Can someone who ever served as president ever be held accountable for something they did in the waning days of their presidency or afterwards? And I think, to me, the way the court thinks about one question is going to be completely different than the way it thinks about the other. And legal scholar after legal scholar has said, if every president is immunized forever against anything they ever do because they were president, it would invite like the worst presidents, basically in the future of the United States, because people would run to basically try to immunize themselves for everything. So I think the court has a ton of really complicated stuff to figure out, but predicting what people who Trump nominated are going to do and conflating what happens in some of these individual states with the broader executive power question, I think, is really problematic.
I took that as even more than a prediction, didn't you? I mean, this is Trump's lawyer.
Advice,
I mean, remember who brung you to the dance, Brett Kavanaugh? That's the way I took it.
Lifetime appointment. I don't think he needs to remember anything.
Yeah, well, that's very... Biden is going to describe the fight to preserve democracy in his first campaign event of the year later this afternoon. He prepared for the big speech by sitting down for lunch earlier this week with a small group of historians, and my next guest was one of them. Princeton professor Sean Wilentz joins me now. Thank you so much for being here. I know that you can't disclose specifics of what the president said, which I completely understand and respect. But can you just describe the overall tone of the conversation and kind of why you were there and what he was hoping to achieve?
Right. Well, great to be with you, Dana. We were talking about American history. We were talking about the situation we're in now and what the past what light it has to shed on the present. It's an extraordinary time. It's been that way for a while, a long time. In fact, the president got into the race in the first place back in 2019 precisely because of Charlottesville and because of things that were happening there. And things haven't really changed very much. If anything, they've only gotten worse. So the president, who's a student of history, really wanted to get our views of how we're to look upon the current situation in historical perspective. And that's what we did.
Well, on that, you're obviously a very good person to talk to about that, because you're not just a historian. You have a large body of work focused on American democracy, specifically looking at that. And I want to ask you about that, looking ahead to the speech this afternoon, about why it is so important to Joe Biden, and also the location, Valley Forge. I was talking to somebody in the Biden orbit earlier today who noted that he will lean heavily into the idea that George Washington, not General Washington, but President Washington, willingly gave up the presidency, with a not so subtle contrast to his predecessor who did not.
Yes, in terms of the succession of power, there were those who wanted to make General Washington, President Washington, a kind of king, and he refused to do that. The American Revolution was fought against monarchy, it fought against that system of government. I think that he's choosing Valley Forge, though, that's a military site.
Sure. That's
a site when the spirits of the American Revolution were at a low. It didn't seem as if the army was going to hold together. They were stuck out there in the snows of Pennsylvania in that winter, and things were not looking good. So it was a low point at which, in fact, the American cause under Washington rallied. And I think he's chosen that spot particularly with that in mind, that we're at a crisis now. We've been in a crisis for a while, but now is a very difficult moment. So I think that to the extent that he's going to be, calling upon that symbolism, it's as much to rally people behind the American ideal, behind the democratic ideal, as much as anything else. Yeah.
Oh, that's really interesting. That makes sense. I want to get your take on a really staggering statistic. There's a new Washington Post and University of Maryland poll that shows 34% of Republicans, 34% of Republicans, so a third of Republicans, believe the conspiracy theory that FBI operatives organized and encouraged the January 6th attack. I should also say that 30% of independents and 13% of Democrats also believe that. Can you put this into historical context? And, history is, it may be hard to do because in the current climate, the media is so fractured and there are so many different ways to get information that a lot of the people probably who said that are only consuming information from outlets that are feeding them these conspiracy theories.
I think you've hit exactly the right point, Dana. I mean, conspiracy theories are American as apple pie. It's been part of American politics from the very beginning. But, now we have the possibility of being unable to disprove them. It's very difficult because people are constantly fed these ideas that, they make an uncertain world look clear, look plausible. Things are not messy. Things are messy. Things are not together. Well, conspiracies give you someone to blame. And with the Trump campaign, Trump is taking it to a whole different level. We've had conspiracies. Just thinking about the conspiracy theories of the 1950s during the McCarthy era, and they were out there and they had their day, but they were eventually undone. But Joe McCarthy didn't have social media. Joe McCarthy didn't have Truth Social. He didn't have the kinds of things that former President Trump has at his disposal to continually feed these ideas. So it doesn't surprise me, actually, that larger percentage of the Republican people who self-described Republicans believe that. In fact, the Republican Party, I don't think the Republican Party actually exists anymore. The way that I was, as an historian, I've looked at it. It's now something else. It's turned into something else. Yeah. This happens in American history. Parties come, parties go. In the 1850s, the Whig Party disappeared. A new party came along. Well, I think we've seen some of that now. The Republican Party, it's not just that it's not your grandfather's Republican Party. It's not the Republican Party. It's something else.
Yeah. It was the party of Lincoln, and the Democrats are the ones who wanted to keep slavery in the South. Very different time. Democracy's on the line. That's President Biden's message as he kicks off his 2024 campaign using the third anniversary of the Capitol insurrection to warn what's at stake if Donald Trump wins another term. Plus, blasting the frontrunner, Ron DeSantis escalated his attacks on Trump over both policy and personality, with just days left to close the huge gap with the former president. And don't sit back. The former president needs his supporters to show up on caucus night to win the dominating victory he says he's expecting. It's why he's headed back to Iowa today to try to get out the vote. I'm Dana Bash. Let's go behind the headlines and inside politics. We start near historic Valley Forge in Pennsylvania, where the George Washington troops were there for a very long time. And he was leading, of course, during the Revolutionary War, fighting against British tyranny. Today, it is where Joe Biden will make his re-election pitch that Donald Trump poses an existential threat to U.S. democracy. CNN's Arlette Saenz is there. Arlette, what are you hearing from your sources inside the campaign about what we expect to hear from the president?
Well, Dana, President Biden's advisors really view this speech as an opportunity to lay out the foundational arguments of his campaign. President Biden is set to warn that democracy is under threat, and former President Donald Trump is the major reason why. They chose the anniversary of the January 6th insurrection because they believe that that was an event that continues to resonate with voters, with one advisor telling us that they believe in the end voters will render judgment on January 6th when they head to the ballot box in November. The president is expected to speak in very blunt terms about the insurrection, as well as what he views as former President Trump's role in that event. He is also expected to call out political violence in this country, saying that any candidate running for president should be able to say that political violence should not be tolerated. The president is also expected to draw on the symbolism of the area. We are just a few miles away from Valley Forge, where George Washington and his troops prepared during a very long winter for a time of fighting. And the president will draw specifically from some of the words that Washington used himself to describe the mission and resolve of his troops. The president will say that the fundamental question of this election is whether democracy is still a, quote, sacred cause for this country. He's also expected to draw a contrast between Washington, who willingly gave up power after 2 terms as president, with former President Donald Trump, who has refused to accept the results of the 2020 election. But this all comes as the Biden campaign has really been quite eager to start ramping up their contrast with the former president at a time when the Iowa caucuses, the Republican primary campaign, is set to kick off formally in the coming weeks. In the end, the campaign does believe that democracy is not a sideline issue, it is a central issue of the campaign. But one thing going forward is whether any other types of issues will really resonate and dominate voters' attention. But the president has argued that democracy, everything else flows from it. When you think about it, the economy and also abortion, and they are hoping that this speech today will really serve as the opening salvo of the campaign.
Yeah, and even pre-January 6th, of course, as you know, his aides are arguing that the soul of America was the whole crux of his campaign the first time around after Charlottesville. Arlette, thank you so much for that reporting. Let's talk to our reporters here in the studio, Sungmin Kim of the Associated Press, Margaret Talev of Axios, and Tia Mitchell of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. First of all, I want to say that you two were actually at the Capitol.
I was not.
You were not at the Capitol. You were on the Capitol on January 6th, so I want to get to that in a minute. Let's focus first on the speech that President Biden is going to give today, and I just want to kind of condense some of the reporting we heard from Arlette and look at what we have in our story on CNN.com. The fundamental question that the president is going to pose is this: is democracy still a sacred cause in America? And his answer to that is yes. And he believes that America's answer to that is yes. And he also believes that the election in 2024 is fundamentally about that question. What are you hearing from your sources at the White House?
Well, I think if anyone who is close to Biden will tell you that this isn't just a political issue. This is sort of at the core of who he is as a human being. This is what he really fundamentally believes, which is why, as you mentioned, he launched his presidential campaign looking at what happened in Charlottesville, arguing about the battle for the soul of the nation and really making that a core of his campaign. And then his advisors would tell you that they believe it just also happens to be good politics for him, which is why not only you're starting this year with this broad theme of democracy, but it's going to be a continual theme throughout the campaign. And they feel, in terms of whether it's good politics, they will argue that it worked well for him when they had their detractors ahead of the midterm elections, that voters really do care about the fundamentals of democracy, and that Biden himself will, that his vow to protect that at all costs will really resonate with voters, especially when they see who's on the other side, which is Donald Trump, who did not willingly let go this election, pushed efforts to fight it, and they feel that's a really effective contrast for them.
Assuming he gets the nomination.
Assuming he gets the nomination, big caveat.
You know, I was talking to somebody in Biden world before coming on the air who said just a little bit of color that I thought was interesting, that they view this as such an important speech that there was kind of a message that went out, don't schedule any meetings during the speech. Like, we all really want to watch this, not to say that they don't all say that they watch the president no matter when he speaks, but this is one of those. And we all know, covering the White House, having covered the White House, what those moments are, and that is certainly how they view this. The other thing that's interesting is that they're kind of hoping that this is a trap, that there's bait in this speech for Donald Trump, and that he takes the bait and starts to push more and more. We're going to play in a second that he has been talking about January 6th, but he starts to play more and more on the Biden sort of political battlefield.
Right. I mean, I think, Dana, for months now, the question has been, do voters want to hear about January 6th anymore? They care more about the economy. I think it would be a mistake to take that and say voters don't ever want to respond to questions about American democracy again. The issue is that they don't only want Joe Biden focused on January 6th when they want to know that he's doing something on the economy. Having said that, it would be like political malpractice for Joe Biden to stop talking about this thing that happened, which is the biggest, forget about political, the biggest apolitical argument against Donald Trump is that he refused to acknowledge the election results. He got a lot of Americans misinformed and whipped up. Some of them acted violently that day, and there were multiple efforts on the ground as well as beforehand to block or overturn the election results. So that is a core to Joe Biden's argument, not only for why he should be reelected, but for why Donald Trump shouldn't serve as president again. So of course he's going to talk about it. The trick for him beyond today is how he balances that with showing Americans that he's focused on the economy, that he's focused on protecting the border, that he's dealing with crime and all these other issues.
Yeah, and you were there on January 6th. I'm sure it's hard to him, and we all watched it from the outside in. You and some of our colleagues here, of course, at CNN, were inside and experiencing it. So it must be still sort of odd to hear just only 3 years hence that, never mind that Joe Biden and Democrats and even some of Donald Trump's Republican opponents have to keep reminding people that this was a very dangerous time for democracy, but in some cases convincing people that this actually happened.
Right,
which
yeah.
is still...
And again, as someone who was there, I can say, you know, there were people who were trying to break into the chambers when Congress was in session to disrupt that session. And there were people who died, and I know a lot on the right, they like to talk about Ashley Babbitt. She did die that day. She died because a police officer thought he was protecting members of Congress from a mob. But she wasn't the only person who died that day. There were people trampled by the crowds. There were people who had medical emergencies. So I just think it's been whitewashed in a way that's very problematic. And that's why I think a lot of members of Congress, a lot of elected officials will come back to this anniversary year after year because a thing happened that was very, very serious, and we shouldn't allow people who have an agenda to undermine that.
So, Margaret, you mentioned, one of you guys mentioned the notion that democracy isn't necessarily high on the list when pollsters ask people about it. And we'll just show one example. Gallup poll last month, election/democracy was only at 5%. One interesting note that I heard from a Biden source this morning was to look at it a different way, which is right track, wrong track, which we're going to pull up from a different poll. This is the Wall Street Journal in December. And I mean, look, historically, if you're a political strategist and you see that, you say, uh-oh, this is really bad news for Joe Biden. What the Biden campaign says is that part of that, people worried about the wrong track, is people concerned about the notion of another Trump presidency. And that's what they're trying to play into here. And it's nuanced, but it's a critical factor, the Biden camp believes, in how people feel.
Right, and it also goes to their theory that 2024 is not necessarily going to be a referendum on Joe Biden, the incumbent president, that it is going to be a contrast between Joe Biden and presumably Donald Trump as a Republican candidate. It is a little bit more challenging, certainly compared to 2020, when Joe Biden is the incumbent in the White House. He does have a record that voters and us, the media and the public, are scrutinizing, but it sort of goes to their case that once we make that effective contrast with Trump, we're confident that voters will land with us.
We're almost out of time in the segment, but I do want to quickly play for our viewers, because I think it's important. You don't hear it that much. What Donald Trump has been saying recently on the campaign trail about January 6th.
I've never spoken to a crowd as large as this, and that was because they thought the election was rigged. And they were there proud. They were there with love in their heart. That was an unbelievable, and it was a beautiful day. If you remember in Minneapolis, where they took over the police station, they took it over and they burned it down. By the way, what happened to those people? Are those people in jail with the J6 hostages? What happened to those people, come to think of it? They're not in jail with the J6 hostages. I don't call them prisoners, I call them hostages. They're hostages.
Right, that's insane. So, and what's going to happen between Joe Biden's speech, the president's speech, and the November general election, if Trump ends up being the nominee, is ads with image after image after image after image, and sound and sound and image and sound and testimonials of what happened, what actually happened that day, and how it impacted the country and individual people.
All right, we got to take on me. They're all in the Hawkeye State today, trying to win over those last-minute, undecided voters. Haley's first event of the day is over. DeSantis is still going on. Both, of course, participated in last night's CNN town hall in Des Moines. That's where our Jeff Zeleny is. He's actually right outside of Des Moines in Cumming, Iowa. Jeff, doesn't look as cold now as it did earlier in the day when I saw you, but what are we hearing from the candidates so far today?
Well, Dan, it's really a continuation of the argument that they made last night on stage at Grandview University. And those arguments were considerably sharper and aimed at former President Donald Trump. Obviously, one of the reasons is time is running short for them to draw those distinctions. Of course, distinctions that are very familiar, but they haven't always been articulated by some of these Republican rivals. But this morning, just a few moments ago, the Florida governor again urging Republicans to consider what Donald Trump did and didn't do in office.
You didn't do it the first 4 years. What kind of confidence do we have to know you're going to do? And I look at the border and how bad that is. And yes, you know, the blame goes on Biden's shoulders. But let's just be clear. If Trump had built the wall like he promised, Biden would not have been able to bring in 8 million people. That's the whole point of a wall. It prevents an invasion of your country.
So immigration, of course, one of the biggest flashpoints in American politics at the moment. DeSantis there sort of doing a 1-2 punch, or trying to, blaming Donald Trump for not building the wall, then of course blaming the Biden administration for the current crisis at the border. Nikki Haley, for her part, is really urging voters to think about electability. Last night she said Americans don't want another nail-biter election. They want to move on to a new generation of leaders. Here's what she said this morning in Des Moines.
I get it. I mean, you look at the situation in our country, and whether you think Joe Biden is a nice man or not, you feel it everywhere. It's Democrat chaos. Whether it's the economy, whether it's education, whether it's the border, there's a reason 75% of Americans don't want a Trump-Biden rematch. They're tired. They want to see something go forward. And what I am telling you is, I'm not talking about just Republicans. I'm talking about winning the majority of Americans. Because if we're going to save our country, we've got to stop all the division and the fighting.
So new television ads also are on the air heading into this second to last weekend of campaigning. Nikki Haley's Super PAC, which now has spent more than any other entity in Iowa, which is extraordinary when you think about it, because a year ago she didn't have a Super PAC like this. And they are making the electability argument as well. So, Dana, when we kind of exhale here and think about the final 10 days of this Iowa caucus campaign, it's ending in an entirely different way than it started. Ron DeSantis, he was the leading rival to Donald Trump. He came into Iowa with so much promise. Of course, he has struggled throughout the year, but his advisors believe that he is closing stronger. And I think we saw that improved and changed performance last night on the town hall stage. He is looking forward to a one-on-one debate next week with Nikki Haley to really draw those distinctions. We should also point out, though, Donald Trump arrives in just a few hours. He's trying to keep his supporters all on board and fired up as well. Dana?
Yeah, he sure is. I'm still stuck on you saying we're exhaling. I'm still very much inhaling, but I'll take your I'll take your word for it. Maybe it'll feel different when I get to that great state of Iowa. See you soon. Thank you so much, Jeff. Appreciate it.
Bring your earmuffs. It'll be cold next
I
week.
will. I'm going to have a lot more than that. Back with our panel here. So I want to go back to what Jeff was just talking about. And this morning, you heard DeSantis, you just played it, really stepping up, I would say kind of finally, when it comes to Donald Trump. He started it last night. What we just heard was about the border. It was about a lot more than the border when he was with Caitlin Collins at our town hall last night.
I think a 2024 election where the Democrats get to run against a candidate that is going through all this stuff, that is going to give the Democrats an advantage. You don't want it to be a referendum on Trump and the past. You want it to be a referendum on Biden's failures. Donald Trump's not willing to show up on the debate stage. Has he come to communities and answered questions?
Do you think Donald Trump is not pro-life?
Of course not. I mean, when you're saying that pro-life protections are a terrible thing, by definition, you are not pro-life.
That, Margaret, to me was among the most interesting answers that he gave, because it is true that Donald Trump, for most of his life, was very openly pro-choice,
Yes.
in his words. He changed.
And then he became a Republican candidate.
And he changed, and he provided the Supreme Court that overturned Roe. So it's like, on the one hand, he might not be wrong about his true feelings, but these voters might say, who cares what his true feelings are? He finally did what we wanted to do.
Yeah, all of these arguments are arguments that when you listen to, you're like, yeah, that seems like something that someone who wanted to unseat Donald Trump and take over as the nominee of a party would say. In August, the summer before, it's like a week until the caucuses, and now you're starting the beginning of the ramping up of the attacks onto the Donald Trump. It's very interesting, but I will say this. Iowa caucuses are different than primaries in other places. And polls are imperfect. They're kind of the best thing we have to try to study what large groups of people think about different issues. But what happens in caucuses is turnout is more important than in any other kind of contest, and that people are persuadable right up until the moment when they have chosen which part of the room they want to stand in, basically. And so that has been one of the big questions, and Jeff has been alluding to it, is what is Donald Trump's ground game? Does he really have Iowa locked down? Do Iowans feel that he's taken them for granted? What's the deal with the evangelical vote? You know, there is a lot more possibility to move things at the last minute, but in no time in Iowa history has anything moved that much.
Well, you know, you mentioned that the caucuses are different. They are very different for a lot of reasons. What Nikki Haley said this morning about the fact that she wants Democrats and independents to re-register and cross over to go and caucus for her. I mean, she's trying to appeal above and beyond the Republican base, the Trump base, and the question is whether that's going to work. It is a message, again, that she's stepping up when it comes to the far and away front runner, Donald Trump. She started that, well, she didn't start that, but she added to that last night with Aaron.
You said rightly or wrongly, chaos follows him. Is it rightly or wrongly? Is he the one who causes that chaos, or is he just the unwitting victim?
It's both. I mean, you see a lot of these cases they brought against him are political in nature. and there's no basis on it. And then you see some that he's going to have to answer for. I used to tell him he's his own worst enemy. And so I think at the end of the day, we don't need anyone who's getting in their feelings. We don't need anyone that's getting personal about anything. We have a country to save.
I loved her question. Is it rightly or wrongly?
Yeah. And I think, Nikki Haley's answer was interesting because there are a lot of people, Democrats, and I would guess some independents, who don't think these court cases are politically motivated. They think that Donald Trump is finally being held accountable for some of the